So we've just given a really quick refresher about the different programs that make up the red meat integrity system. Now we're going to get stuck into some more detail around LPA and each of the requirements that go and the record keeping associated with each of those, because good records and systems are the foundation of the integrity system. We'll take a deep dive now into record keeping and give you some, some tips and some practical ideas to help you with your record keeping aligned with the requirements of LPA. And basically, the key message here is that there is no perfect formula when it comes to record keeping. In terms of how, and we would have just seen there through that little poll, some producers find that keeping clear notes in a diary or a record book works well for them. Others keep their records within their farm management software program or computer spreadsheets and Word documents and the like. But regardless of the method, it's important that all the relevant management activities are accurately and clearly recorded and that you can find them and that they capture the required information. Because should you be required to participate in an LPA audit, your LPA records will be reviewed by an auditor. So it's important to make sure that they're accurate and up to date. It's also really important that you get your records in order well before an audit. An audit is not the time to do this, or nor should it only be the only motivation for doing it. Providing lifetime traceability through good record keeping can actually also be a marketing advantage when it comes to selling your livestock as well. So to make it easier for you, ISC has created some record keeping templates which are aligned to the 7 LPA requirements, and they outline all the information that you need to be recording. Now, these are available on the ISC website. We've got an integrity insight for you there up on the screen, and you'll see a couple of those throughout tonight's webinar. Keep an eye out for those, but we'll also provide you with a lot of these information points in the post-webinar email as well. But these record keeping templates, you can get them, download them from the website. You can order them in hard copy through the LPA website, or you can simply call ISC customer service and we'll share the number with you following the session as well. And as I said, you're not obligated to use these templates. If you're already capturing the required information in another format or program, that's fine. But if you don't currently have a recording system, they're a really good place to start. A recent change made to the LPA Service Centre now allows all your LPA documentation and your records to be saved directly within your producer account. And our integrity insight for this new feature is the option to also be able to complete your property risk assessment and your farm biosecurity plan entirely digitally rather than on a printed template. So I guess there's a number of benefits for storing your information within the LPA Service Centre, that all your records are in one location, you can retrieve them at any time, and you've got easy access to them for auditing purposes. We've got a fact sheet on how to create or upload documents in your LPA account, and that's available on the ISC website, and you can check the post-webinar email for the link as well. So what about the different types of records that you might be required to keep as part of LPA or as part of your farm business more broadly? There's two different types of records. There's property management records, which are often completed and reviewed once a year. Now, these include the property risk assessment, the biosecurity plan, and the animal welfare certification. And then there's also what we refer to as operational records. Now, these are records which are filled out daily or weekly and include and based on activities as they're completed. And these might include things like visitor registers for biosecurity, feed and livestock treatment records, commodity vendor decks, NVDs, and livestock movements and the like. Now, as mentioned previously, it's important to note that when there are opportunities to utilise your current record keeping systems for purposes of LPA, then that's totally acceptable as long as all the required information is captured. So don't feel that you need to create duplicate records using the LPA templates if you already have a current system that can be utilised. And conversely, if you do adopt an LPA template, there may be an opportunity to add to that template in order to capture other farm information that's of use to your particular business. Things like costs for budgeting and all that sort of thing is some other information that you can do. Now, the other thing with records is that records required for LPA might also be useful for other programs or for other state-based requirements, or if, for example, if you've got your chemical user accreditation and you're required to keep records there, if there's a state-based requirement for a biosecurity plan, or even if you're within a supply chain and you're required to keep certain records, the LPA records will help you as part of that program. So you don't need to think of the LPA record keeping purely in isolation. So we'll now run through the 7 LPA requirements and focus on basically the structure of this will be how do you go about meeting the requirement for the particular risk area, and then some ideas for practical record keeping for that particular area. So for property risk assessments, you need to identify any possible risk on your property where livestock can come into contact with physical and or chemical contaminants, and develop strategies for how this risk will be controlled. Now, to meet this requirement, you need to do a couple of things. You need to complete a risk assessment and a map. You need to update the risk assessment when changes occur on farm. You need to document and file the risk assessment and map for auditing purposes. And just to note that this can actually be completed digitally in your LPA account from scratch. So here on the screen, we have an example risk assessment map from our record keeping templates. Now, a risk assessment must be carried out, as I said, when changes to the enterprise's current activities occur, such as a change in land use on the property. And it also requires that you mark on a property map suspect areas such as old yards and dip sites, treated yards, old rubbish dump sites, treated power poles and the like. And you can see that those risk areas have been marked as examples on the screen here. Here's another example from the ISC record keeping template where risks are documented and a description is provided of how the site is managed to eliminate the risk of contamination. So you can see the first example here is about an old rubbish dump. So the information that's being captured is the possible risk or the risk site. So that's the rubbish dump. The reason or the risk identified. So obviously within this rubbish dump, there are old chemical drums and batteries. Then you might have done some further analysis, or you have some extra results that can add extra information, I guess, about the risk. So here we've had some soil samples done that have shown up a dieldrin and a BHC readings. And then there's a brief description of how the site is being managed to eliminate the risk of livestock contamination. So the information there is that the rubbish dump was fenced out in 2005. So you would simply, based on the information you've captured within the map, you would then also provide a little bit of extra detail here on this documentation. The next LPA requirement that we'll take a look at is biosecurity. Now, the biosecurity requirement was introduced in October 2017. And for this requirement, you must implement on-farm biosecurity systems to minimise the risk of infectious disease being introduced to livestock production properties and the subsequent spread of any such diseases. Now, to meet this requirement, you need to keep a formal documented farm biosecurity plan. Now, this can be completed digitally in your LPA account. You need to source a livestock health declaration or equivalent for introduced livestock. You need to have systems to notify unusual disease, illness or mortalities, and also to keep records of movements of people, vehicles and equipment entering your property where reasonable and practical. Now, a couple of things to note with biosecurity is that some producers may have completed a JBAS or a Yoni's farm biosecurity plan. This will meet the LPA requirements. Similarly, if you have used another program or template to create a biosecurity plan, and there are plenty of templates for biosecurity available, just check that it covers all the required information from the LPA template to ensure you are compliant with the biosecurity requirements of LPA, but then it should be fine. And with these record keeping templates within the ISC website, you'll also find a series of checklists that will outline exactly what the requirements for each of these different 7 elements of LPA are. Now, here on the screen is an example from the ISC record keeping templates. the formal documented farm biosecurity plan needs to address the following. It needs to manage and record the introduction and movement of livestock in a way that minimises the risk of introducing and or spreading infectious diseases. Where reasonable and practical, it needs to control people, outline, how you're going to control people, equipment and vehicles entering the property, thus minimising the potential for property contamination, and if possible, keep a record of such movements. And it also needs to outline how you intend to prevent and control animal diseases on farm by regularly monitoring and managing livestock. Now, the key with biosecurity is to focus on what is relevant to your farm and your production system and any specific requirements that relate to your state or territory. It doesn't mean that you need to tick every box or answer every single question, because some things may not be applicable to your situation. The important thing to consider is what risks apply to your farm and to your business and how you're going to manage those risks. So biosecurity is definitely not a one-size-fits-all. It's very much about the risk on your property. And a really practical example, so here on the property where I'm from, we're superfine merino producers. We're also quite close to Canberra, so we in almost a peri-urban area where we have 7 neighbours and we have a river going through our property. So for me, our risks are really around incursion of lice, for example, and also weeds travelling down through the river. So fencing for us is really important, and regularly checking boundary fences, because our neighbours have crossbred and sheep where wool is not of such importance. So for us, lice is a real issue. So that's our main biosecurity risk. That obviously is not going to apply to everybody, depending on your farming system and what your risks are as well. So very much not a one-size-fits-all for biosecurity. On the screen here is just an example of the record keeping template for a property visitor register that can be used if needed. So you're capturing the key information there is around the date, the name, where the people came from or the business they belong to, their signature, telephone, reason for the visit, where they visited on farm. They obviously may not go everywhere on the farm, time in, the time out. And hopefully you can see with some of this information that you're capturing, it's also would be useful in other instances within your business, for example. So if you needed to go back and track when somebody was on the farm for another particular reason, if you've kept a register of everyone that's been on farm, that'll certainly help you later on. The next requirement for LPA that we'll take a look at is animal welfare. Animal welfare is a really important requirement for the Livestock Production Assurance Program, and this requirement, along with biosecurity, was introduced in October 2017. Now, to meet this requirement, you need to have a copy of the standards and guidelines for animal welfare accessible as a reference. The person responsible for the property that has the LPA accreditation needs to have received training in those standards and guidelines through the LPA learning program, and any staff involved in livestock husbandry need to be familiar with the contents of the animal welfare standards and guidelines and have been trained in a manner that's consistent with those guidelines. Now, the integrity insight here is to simply download the standards and guidelines and save it as a favourite on your computer or your laptop, so all your team members can access it. And it's available, the URL there on the screen, but again, we'll share that link with you as part of the post-webinar email. Here on the screen, we have an example of this is a certificate of completion that you'll receive when you do the animal welfare learning module and assessment as part of your LPA accreditation. You need to have that. That is the record. You need to have that record available for an audit purpose. So the next requirement that we'll take a look at is safe and responsible animal treatments. For this requirement, you must undertake steps to ensure that animal treatments are administered in a safe and responsible manner that minimises the risk of chemical residues and physical hazards. To meet this requirement, you need to document and file all animal treatment details. You need to complete a chemical user course. Note when equipment used for livestock is cleaned. You need to record authorisation and directions for off-label use of chemicals. You also need to make a note of any animals that were exposed to physical contaminants like broken needles. And you also need to mark animals treated with HGPs with a triangular ear mark. Now, the integrity insight for this particular requirement is to make sure that you keep records for a minimum of 3 years in accordance with your state legislation, or for the time that the livestock are on the pick, whichever is longer, because of course if those animals remain on the pick and then you do sell or transfer them, it's important that you have accurate records for that particular animal so that you can complete your national vendor deck when required. Now here on the screen, we've got an example of a livestock treatment record. An insight or a tip here is to ask your supplier to add the vet product batch number or expiry date and the withholding or withholding period or the export slaughter interval period to the invoice for your treatment record. So you've got somewhere to go and retrieve that information really quickly rather than going down to the shearing shed or the cattle yards and trying to find an old chemical drum where the label's faded or the label's come away. Now, if you don't know what the withholding period or the export slaughter interval is, you can visit the APVMA website. We'll certainly share that with you as a link as part of the post-webinar email as well. And just remember that withholding periods and export slaughter intervals are quite often not the same. So the type of information that you'd be capturing there, and you can see that this is just from our hard copy templates, for example, or one that you could fill in by hand, but you could easily turn this into an Excel spreadsheet, for example, or a table within a Word doc. You're capturing information such as the treatment date, the description, location, and number of livestock treated, the product name, the batch number, the dose rate or the rate applied, the withholding period and export slaughter interval, the date safe for slaughter, and who they were treated by. Now, really useful to capture things like the date safe for slaughter, so that as you're processing animals through the yard, for example, wanting to sell them, then you've got to go back and double check when you treated them and quickly work out based on the withholding period what the date is. Imagine how easy it would be if you actually just had that written down. So not only have you got a 14-day withholding period, but you also know that the date they're ready to go for slaughter. And I'd also just encourage everybody, another little tip here is to use your phone. So you can take photos of the products that you're treating, you can take photos of the mobs of the herds of animals that you're treating as well, with the batch number and the chemical as part of the photo, so you've automatically got that. Photos are always date stamped as well, which is really useful if you can't remember a treatment date. If you've left your paddock book back at the house, for example. And certainly you can use things like the notes function on your phone or calendars as well to mark in the calendar when an animal would be safe for slaughter and is out of a withholding period, and set an automatic reminder in your phone. So we've all got smartphones, or most of us do, and a lot of those features you don't require on, you don't rely on internet connectivity as well. So you can do it offline while you're out in the paddocks. Just a really handy tip. On the screen here now is an example of the chemical inventory record. So this is the information that you might be asked to keep as well for your farm chemical user accreditation. Same information, the date received, the product name, the expiry date, manufacturer, the batch number, and who added the information or who added the chemical to the shed. The insight here again is to ask your supplier to add the product batch number and expiry date to the invoice, so that when you're updating your records, when you're back in the office, you can simply access that from the invoice rather than dragging the drum in the house or going down the back shed with a napkin and having to write it on it and then transfer when you get back to the house. Or alternatively, just quickly grab a photo and you've got that with you when you're updating your records. The next requirement that we'll take a look at is stock foods, fodder crops, grain and pasture treatments. Now for this requirement, you must guarantee that animals are not exposed to foods containing chemical contamination or have been fed animal products. Now, to help you meet this requirement, you need to keep records of all agricultural chemical treatments around the farm, document any introduced stock feed, have management systems in place to identify any livestock that may have become contaminated, map or list any treated or contaminated sites, and you should source and file commodity vendor decks as much as possible that accompany any introduced stock feed. Now, here on the screen, again, just an example of a crop pasture and paddock treatment record. So similar, absolutely similar things that you'd have to be keeping as part of your farm chemical accreditation, things like the date of application, the paddock identification and location on the property, the crop that was treated, the area treated, who it was treated by, the application rate, wind direction and speed, which is really useful if you have to manage things like spray drift, or certainly have to defend claims of spray drift later on. The tank mix that was used, so the product, the rate, the batch number, all that information, and then the date of then that information, sorry, is just repeated there on the screen as well. This type of information is also, as I said before, useful broader than the LPA. So, for example, would be really helpful if you were having to manage work health and safety requirements as well. So you could go back and look at particular staff, for example, that might have been treating or applying chemical, or a contractor and things like that if you ran into problems as well. So record keeping just helps you better manage some of those risks on farm. Here on the screen, we have an example of a grain and fodder treatment record. So things like when grain and fodder is brought onto the farm, or if it's treated, sorry, the application, the location, what it was treated with, how much was treated, the application rate, and again, who's doing that, and of course, information about the chemical that was used at the time. The example on the screen there now is around introduced stock feed and a record of that. So the information here that you would be capturing is the date that the feed was brought in, what it was and how much, where it came from, so the origin, the commodity vendor deck number or the equivalent reference number if it's available, any residue analysis or certificate that's available, or if you've had any further testing done, where it was stored, and again, who it was signed by the person that took and made that record for you. The example on the screen there now is a livestock feeding record. So similarly, again, what the feed stuff was, where it was stored, what mob it was fed to, the feeding period, so from start through to finish, and then the person responsible for the activity on a particular day or over a particular time frame. For example, here again, this sort of information would be really useful for managing things like work health and safety, but also would be really useful if you added additional information such as cost. So you could look at gross margins or cost of production and things like that, in terms of particularly for different mobs or different grades of stock on the property, and would be really useful in a drought or a feedlot confinement seeding. Confinement feeding scenario. Now, as I did mention around commodity vendor declarations, all introduced stock feed should be accompanied by a commodity vendor deck to guarantee that the feed purchased is safe from any chemical contamination. Now, the commodity vendor deck needs to provide details of the chemical used to treat the commodity, the rate and date of chemical application, and any relevant withholding period or export slaughter interval that was shown on the chemical label. Now, we do hear quite often that it's quite hard to get, or you don't receive a commodity vendor deck. Then you need to assess the risk of that and then keep a record of that risk if you are able to find it. Alternatively, you can have a sample tested for residues, but when it comes to filling in your national vendor deck, if you're not sure of the history of the fodder that was fed to the animals, then you can apply a default 60-day withholding period to that product. Now, we will include a link to the commodity vendor deck in the post-webinar email, and you'll be able to get more information on our website as well. Now, the next requirement that we'll look at is preparation for dispatch of livestock. Now, for this requirement, you must guarantee that livestock are fit to transport and ensure that they experience minimal stress and contamination during assembly and transport. Now, how do you meet this requirement? You need to ensure that the livestock are fit to load. You need to record transport details, including vehicle rego and key times. You need to document and file the LPA national vendor decks. and you need to record reports of animals which may have been exposed to any physical contaminants. And the really obvious integrity insight here is to keep a copy handy of is the animal fit to load, or the fit to load guide. Now it's a really handy document that can go certainly in the glove box. Got some great pictures there around, and a fair bit of clarity around what is acceptable, particularly in sale yards, for example, around cancers and injuries and things like that. And then also really helpful in terms of condition scoring and what is acceptable, particularly in dry conditions, with the different classes of stock as well. So here on the screen, we also have another another example, of keeping your dispatch records. So this would be the information you would keep here is basically the date, the number of livestock, the description, breed, sex and age, date and time of yarding, the date and time of dispatch, and any comments there. Now, again, having all this information in one table as compared to flicking through national vendor decks, for example, might be really useful at tax time when you're trying to do your livestock reconciliation, and you know sort of what's gone on, what's gone off, and the like, as will be a couple of the other templates which I'll show you in the next couple of minutes. So the next requirement we're going to take a look at is around livestock transactions and movements. But okay, so what we'll do now, we will take a look at this livestock transactions and movements. Now, for this requirement, basically, you must guarantee that animals sold are not exposed to food safety hazards and that they meet all traceability requirements should a safety issue occur. Now, to meet this requirement, you need to record all purchases and sales. You need to keep all copies of your national vendor decks. You need to record the vendor's name, the address, and the PIC. Record the livestock details and the description of the movements. Keep records of all animals purchased while within a withholding period or an export slaughter interval. And you need to document animals that may have been exposed to any physical contaminants. Now, the biggest tip to stand by what you sell, particularly in relation to this requirement of the LPA, is to fill in every LPA NVD correctly. And the aim is to make sure that every NVD is filled out so that it is clear, complete, and correct. Now, the questions in Part A, which makes up the majority of the NVD, are often where producers need a bit of a hand. Now, these questions are about the animal's history. This information is crucial for food safety and market access, so it's really important here to stay on the safe side. And if in doubt, tick yes and check your records to be sure. Now, that's particularly the case for questions 1 through to 8. Now, that's apart from the question about livestock ownership. Now, if you bred the livestock, then you need to tick yes. If you purchased one or more animals within that consignment covered by that national vendor deck, then you tick no, and you need to indicate the most recent date of purchase. Now, sometimes the consignee and the destination may also be different and have different property identification codes, and it's important that you identify this on the NVD. In the consigned to section, you must record the full name and address of the person and or the company that the livestock are being consigned to. And as I said, in some instances, the address given might be different to the actual physical location. So a really good example of that is when you're transporting livestock to be sold at a sale yard. So the consignee then would be your livestock agent and the destination would be the sale yard location. Now, there's lots of tips on filling in the NVD so that it's clear, complete and correct, including a couple of really handy animations, and we'll share those with you after the webinar. Now, the final step for Part A on the National Vendor Deck is the declaration. Now, when you tick a box on your NVD or you sign the declaration, you're actually guaranteeing that your on-farm practices meet those LPA requirements that we've just been through, and ultimately our customer expectations. So your tick and your signature must be backed up by accurate farm records. Now, for those of you that are LPA accredited, you also have access to the faster, easier ENVD system. Now, it's more accurate than paper forms and ensures that the latest version of the NVD are always being used. It reduces time and duplication spent completing livestock assurance and health declarations. It reduces the cost of storing and retrieving historical consignments for auditing, reporting and admin purposes. And you don't need to wait for new NVD books to arrive. And stakeholders in the supply chain can log in and view consignments, including those that are receiving livestock. Now, the eNVD is not just the NVD, it's actually a system for completing all your consignment paperwork digitally, including livestock assurance and health declarations. And you can access the eNVD system by logging in to the LPA Service Centre using your login details, and you can start creating consignments from there. Now, the other important thing to meet this LPA requirement, which is around livestock transactions and movements, is that you must record all livestock movements onto your PIC on the NLAS database to remain LPA accredited. Now, if a producer is selected to participate in an audit, the auditor will review whether all the transfers for livestock moved onto their PIC have been recorded accurately on the database. Now, the integrity insight here is that state legislation also requires that the buyer or the receiver of the livestock completes the transfer on the database, and penalties may actually be imposed by your state and territory for failing to complete those transfers as required. Now, just a couple of examples here on the screen now. So the first one is around livestock purchases and movements. Now, if all the information here that you'd be capturing would be things like the date, the NVD serial number, the number of stock and the destination paddock where the animals went, so really helpful for biosecurity, the breed and sex, the vendor name, address and the PIC and the notes. So again, rather than shuffling through all your NVDs or having to find them when it came to an audit or tax time, for example, or other business purposes, you've got all that information summarised here in one place. Now, if all the information listed in the livestock movement templates is being captured through your purchase and sale NVDs and your own paddock records, then you don't have to fill in these templates. However, you must have a system in place that allows for you to identify which stock have been exposed to chemical residues or physical contaminants, and this type of record might help you with that. So a system of recording details of all stock that leave a property to enable stock to be traced in a food safety issue is also important, or even an endemic disease if it comes on farm. So if audited, you'll need to be able to demonstrate how your records are achieving this. If you don't have any internal management records such as paddock books that records your on-farm movements, then these templates should be completed for you. And as I said before, you can certainly turn this into an Excel spreadsheet or a table in Word, for example. So the example on the screen there now is for livestock sales and movements. So this is for animals going off the property. The one previously was for animals coming on. And of course, you could have the one spreadsheet and just make it clear whether it was on and off, depending on what's your preference is basically. But again, same information, the date, the serial number of the NVD, the number of head and the paddock of origin where they came from, breed, sex, and where they were going through destination. So we do get a lot of questions about what's involved in an audit, and happy to share some information about that with you. Basically, the key message there is don't panic. Audits are about identifying areas for practical on-farm improvement. And as I said right at the start, it is a condition of accreditation that you do agree to participate in an audit. Your LPA records will be reviewed by an auditor, so it's important to make sure that they are accurate and up to date, and that auditors will certainly give you some practical tips throughout an audit as well. There are about 3,000 audits conducted each year, and all LPA accredited producers may be audited. So what actually happens, or what if issues are identified during the audit process? Well, there's a couple of things. If the issue is minor, then an auditor may record an observation, which means that you simply just need to consider taking action to improve the relevant practice to make sure you're meeting the requirements outlined for that particular element of the LPA. Example here would be not obtaining a commodity vendor deck for purchased fodder or not completing an NVD correctly. If the issue is something that's more significant, then an auditor may raise what's known as a corrective action request, which means that the producer actually needs to take action to ensure compliance with that requirement. And you need to submit evidence in order to close out that corrective action. Now, a common CAR at the moment is where there's no biosecurity plan or where there's a discrepancy between the NVD and the NLIS transfers. So CARs or corrective actions can be managed by uploading the required evidence to your LPA account. And the integrity insight on the slide there refers to a how-to fact sheet, which helps you through the process to manage your corrective actions and your audit process through the LPA Service Centre. So just to finish up this evening, just wanted to outline where you can go for more information. The Integrity Systems Company website, we have lots of information there around each of the 7 elements or the program requirements for the Livestock Production Assurance Program. We've got templates and checklists and certainly more information against each of those requirements as well. You can also get information on the LPA website, including being able to upload your records online now, including actually completing them completely digitally, the risk assessment and the biosecurity plan as well. We've also got a regular email, which hopefully most of you on the call received, was sent out this evening. So Integrity Matters goes out once a month to all LPA accredited producers and many others within the supply chain. Lots of handy tips there. If you don't receive it, then please, you can either shoot us an email or you can subscribe on the website. We're on all the usual social and digital channels, and we've got some great resources on our YouTube channel as well. Don't panic, you don't need to capture all this now. We'll certainly share all the links to these as part of the post-webinar email. Now, I do just need to point out, particularly with the National Vendor Deck, that it is a declaration, that we can't do it for you. Your livestock agent can't do it for you, but absolutely we're here to help and provide you with as much information as possible to make meeting your requirements in the integrity system as simple as possible for you and seamless as possible. Recognising, of course, that the integrity system is really important, and that everybody has a role to play to stand by what we sell and protect this this really amazing industry that we're all part of. But